There's a particular kind of quiet that lives on a ranch in late autumn, the kind that settles into your bones and makes you believe, for a little while, that you've finally outrun everything you were running from. I believed that. For 11 years I believed it. I got up before the sun, I fed the animals, I fixed the fences, and I told myself the silence was peace, and not just the absence of the people I'd lost. And then one gray morning, with an axe in my hands and frost on the woodpile, a stranger walked up my drive carrying a question I had spent a decade refusing to answer. I'm going to tell you what he asked me. I'm going to tell you what I said back, and what it cost me to say it, and how a man can spend his whole life thinking he knows the shape of his own heart, only to find out he's been reading it upside down. But I need you to understand something first, before the axe comes down and the door blows open on everything I'd buried. I was not a good man for most of this story. I want you to sit with that, because the part that broke me wasn't finding out I'd done wrong. It was finding out that someone had loved me anyway all those years, from a distance I'd built myself, brick by silent brick. Stay with me, this one still hurts to say out loud. The axe came down and the round split clean, both halves falling away into the frost like a thing surrendering. I remember that. I remember the sound of it, that dry, satisfying crack that a good piece of oak gives you when the grains run straight and true, and I remember thinking, with the small, dumb contentment of a man who's about to have his whole life turned inside out, that it was going to be a fine morning for wood. The cold was the honest kind, not the wet, aching cold of the valley, but the high, dry cold of my place up on the bench land, where the air gets so clean in October that you can see the far ranges standing sharp against the sky 40 miles off, blue and patient, and older than anything a person could ruin. My breath came out in clouds. My hands, inside the split old gloves I should have replaced 2 winters back, had gone past the sting and into that numb working warmth that comes from swinging steel for an hour. I had maybe 2 cords stacked already against the south wall of the barn, and I wanted 4 before the first real snow. That was the plan. That was the whole plan, the entirety of my ambition for the day, and if I'm being truthful, for the week and the month, and most of the years since I'd come out here to be alone on purpose. My name is Delmer Cade. Folks who knew me, and by then there weren't many, and that was by design, called me Del. I was 61 that autumn, though my hands and my knees had opinions that put me closer to 70, and I ran 160 acres of hard country with a dozen head of cattle, a mean-tempered mule named Judge, and a border collie named Sweep, who was the only living thing on the property that still looked at me like I might be worth loving. I set another round on the block, steadied it. I had a habit, my daughter used to tease me about it back when I still let people close enough to tease me, of counting the splits under my breath. Not out loud, just a movement of the lips. 41, 42. Some men pray. I counted firewood. It came to about the same thing, a way of marking that you were still here, still swinging, still making order out of a world that mostly wanted to fall apart on you. Sweep was the one who noticed first. She'd been lying near the block with her chin on her paws, tolerating the cold the way she tolerated most things, with a kind of ancient patience. Then her head came up. Her ears pricked. She rose without a sound and stood facing the long dirt drive that ran a quarter mile down to the county road, and a low growl started somewhere deep in her chest, not the sharp bark she gave a coyote or a stray, but something more careful, something uncertain. I turned and followed her gaze. A man was walking up my drive. Not driving, walking. That was the first strange thing, because nobody walks up a ranch drive in that country. It's too far from anything, too high, too hard. If you came to see Del Cade, and again, almost nobody did, you came in a truck, and you came because you'd broken down or gotten lost, or you were the man from the feed store, and none of those men ever walked. He was young. That was the next thing I saw as he came up the rise, close enough now that the distance stopped lying about him. Young, and moving wrong, favoring his right leg, one hand pressed flat against his side like he was holding something in, and there was a stiffness to him that spoke of either injury or exhaustion or both. He wore a canvas jacket gone thin at the elbows and a pack slung over one shoulder, and his boots were the cheap kind, city boots, split at the toe and never made for the miles they'd clearly walked. I lowered the axe, rested the head of it on the block, and stood with both hands folded over the top of the handle, the way you stand when you want a man to know you're armed but not yet decided about it. "That's far enough," I said, when he'd come within 30 feet. He stopped. For a long moment neither of us said anything. Sweep had come to stand at my knee, still and taut. The wind moved through the tall dead grass beyond the fence with a sound like something being poured. Somewhere down in the barn, Judge stamped and snorted, sensing the change in the air the way animals do. The young man's face, up close, was gone in a way that had nothing to do with being naturally thin. He'd lost weight recently and hard. You could see it in the way his skin sat wrong on his cheekbones, the way his eyes had gone too big for his face. Dark hair, longer than a working man keeps it, pushed back off a high forehead. A few days of patchy beard. He couldn't have been more than 25, and there was something in the set of his jaw, some stubborn tremble he was fighting to hold still, that made my chest do a thing I didn't have a name for yet. "Are you Delmer Cade?" he said. It wasn't a question the way he said it. It was a thing he already knew and was making himself say out loud, the way you make yourself step off a high place once you've decided to jump. "Who's asking?" I said. He swallowed, his hand pressed harder against his side. "My name's Eli," he said. "Eli Reyes." The name meant nothing to me. I said so with a shrug, and I watched something flinch behind his eyes when I did, a small collapse, quickly caught, like a man who's been braced for a blow finally taking it. "No," he said quietly. "No, it wouldn't. I didn't figure it would." He looked past me at the barn, at the two cords already stacked, at the mule and the far mountains, taking the measure of the place with a strange hunger. Then he looked back at me. "Reyes was my mother's name," he said. "She was Marisol Reyes." A pause. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Before that she was Marisol Cade." The axe handle was suddenly very cold under my hands. I want to be careful here, because this is the part I've gone over 1,000 times since, trying to remember exactly what I felt in that first second, and the truth is I felt almost nothing. A blankness. A great white silence, like the sound the mind makes when it's been handed something too heavy to lift and simply refuses, for a moment, to try. Marisol. I hadn't said that name out loud in God. 26 years. 27. I trained myself not to. I built the not saying of it into a discipline, the way you build a callus over a wound so it stops catching on things. And now here it was, walking up my drive on a boy's split boots, on a cold October morning, with my own stubborn jaw looking back at me out of a stranger's ruined face. "You'd best come inside," I heard myself say. I need to back up. You can't understand what happened in that house that morning without understanding what I'd made of myself in the years before it, and what I'd thrown away to do it, and why. I was raised hard in a hard country by a father who believed that the measure of a man was what he could carry without complaint. My mother died when I was 9, and he never spoke of her again. Not once, not on her birthday, not on the day she passed, and I learned from him the terrible lesson that grief was a private failing best handled by refusing to feel it. I was good at that. I got very, very good at that. It's the one thing I ever mastered completely. I married young. Not to Marisol's mother, I'm getting ahead of myself. When I was 23, I married a girl named Ruth, and we had a daughter, and I loved them both in the clumsy, withholding way my father had taught me, which is to say I provided and I protected, and I never once let either of them see the inside of me. Ruth left when our daughter was 6. She told me, standing in the doorway with her bags packed, that living with me was like living beside a well that had been boarded over. You could hear water down there somewhere. You knew it was deep, but you'd die of thirst before the man who owned it would ever let you drink. I let her go without a word. Of course I did. It would have proved her point to beg. Our daughter's name was Marisol. I raised her mostly alone, and I raised her the only way I knew, which was badly. I was not cruel. I want to be clear about that because it would almost be easier to bear if I'd been cruel. I was worse than cruel. I was absent while standing right there in the room. I fed her and clothed her and drove her to school, and I never, not once in 18 years, told her that I loved her, because the words felt like a weakness my father would have scorned. And by then my father was 10 years in the ground and still running my life from down there. She grew up bright and warm and desperate, desperate the way children of the boarded over well always are, always reaching for water, always sure that if she could just be good enough, funny enough, quiet enough, she'd finally get the man to open up and let her in. She'd draw me pictures. She'd leave me notes. She learned to cook the things I liked. And I took it all the way the desert takes rain, giving nothing back, and I told myself I was teaching her to be strong. When she was 18, she fell in love with a young man named Tomas Reyes, and when she was 19, she got pregnant. And when I found out, I did the thing I have regretted every single day of my life since, which is that I stood in my kitchen, this kitchen, the one Eli and I were walking into now, and I told my daughter that she'd shamed herself and shamed me, and that if she was going to run off with that boy, then she could run off for good and not come back. I said not to come back. I have to write that down plain because for 26 years I dressed it up. I told myself she left. I told myself she chose him over me. I told myself 100 stories where I was the wronged party, the abandoned father, and I got so good at telling them that I half believed them, the way you half believe a lie you've worn smooth from handling. But that's not what happened. What happened is that I told my 19-year-old daughter, pregnant and terrified and still reaching for me even then, that she was dead to me. And she believed me, because I'd spent 19 years teaching her that I meant exactly what I said and never a drop more. She walked out, and I let her. And I never went after her, and I never wrote, and when the letters came, there were letters in the early years, 3 or 4 of them. I know because I burned them unopened in the wood stove and stood there and watched them curl to ash. I burned them. I never knew what they said. I found out that morning, 26 years too late, walking into my own kitchen behind a boy who had her eyes. I put coffee on because my hands needed something to do. The kitchen was warm from the wood stove I'd fed at dawn, and it smelled the way it always smelled, of coffee and wood smoke, and the particular mustiness of a house where one old man lives without anyone to tell him to open a window. Eli lowered himself into a chair at the table carefully, that hand still at his side, and Sweep, who did not trust strangers, went and lay down at his feet, which was the second strangest thing I saw that day. I set a mug in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it like a man trying to remember what warm felt like. "How is she?" I said. I asked it before I could stop myself, and I heard the crack in my own voice on the word she, the first crack in 26 years, and I hated it, and I couldn't help it. Eli looked up at me, and I saw the answer in his face before he said it, the way you see weather coming before you feel it, and my knees found the edge of the counter behind me and I leaned on it because I already knew. "She died," he said, "4 months ago." He said it gently. That was the thing that undid me later when I had time to think about it. He said it gently. This boy I'd never given a single thing to, he broke it to me as softly as he could, like he was worried about me. Cancer. It went fast at the end. She wasn't in pain for too long. I want you to know that. She wasn't in pain for too long. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed in the silence. I have carried a great many hard things in my life. My father taught me to, and I learned the lesson too well, and I've carried loss and shame and the deaths of animals I loved and the slow death of my own hopes, all of it, without complaint, the way a man's supposed to. I did not carry this. This one went straight through me, through the callous and the discipline and the boarded over well, all the way down to the water, and I made a sound I had never made before in my life, a low broken sound, and I put my hand over my mouth to stop it and it would not stop. Marisol was dead. My daughter was dead, and she had been dead 4 months, and I had not known, because I had made it so I would not know. And now there was nothing I could do about any of it. Not the dying and not the 26 years. Nothing. It was all finished and sealed and past. And here was her son at my table telling me gently that she hadn't been in pain for too long. I turned my face to the window so the boy wouldn't see. Out beyond the glass the woodpile sat in the frost, the axe standing where I'd left it, the 2 cords stacked neat against the barn, all of it exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago when I was a man who thought he'd made peace with his life. "I'm sorry," Eli said quietly behind me. "I'm sorry to be the one. There wasn't anybody else who could." We didn't talk for a while after that. I couldn't. I stood at the window until I had myself back under something like control, and then I busied myself with things that didn't need doing, wiped a clean counter, straightened chairs that were already straight. Because a man of my making, when he's been split open, will do anything, anything at all, rather than turn around and let another person see the wound. Eli let me. He drank his coffee and he waited, and there was a patience in him, an understanding that I didn't deserve and couldn't account for. When I finally sat down across from him at the table, my own coffee going cold, I looked at him properly for the first time. He had her eyes, dark and set a little deep and quick to warm. I could see they'd be quick to warm, in a face that wasn't so hollowed out by grief and hunger and whatever hard road had brought him to my door on foot. He had her mouth, too, that same slight upward tuck at the corners that made her look like she was on the edge of a smile even when she wasn't. And he had, God help me, my own jaw, my father's jaw, stubborn, set. The jaw of a man who will walk a quarter-mile up a stranger's drive on a split boot rather than knock on the door and ask for a ride. "You walked," I said. "From where?" "Bus let me off at the county road last night," he said. "I slept in the ditch, didn't want to come up here in the dark." He almost smiled. "Figured a man out here alone might shoot first." "Might have," I admitted. "I know." He turned the mug in his hands. "She told me you would," she said. He stopped, started again more carefully. "She told me a lot of things about you, over the years, and then more at the end when she knew." Something in me braced. Here it was. Here was the reckoning I'd earned, the itemized bill, the boy telling me what a monster his mother's father had been. I sat still and let it come. I even wanted it a little, the way you want the lance in the wound. But it didn't come. "She loved you," Eli said. I looked at him. "That's the thing I came to tell you," he said, and his voice had gone rough now and his eyes were bright and swimming and he had to stop and press the heel of his hand against them before he could go on. "That's the whole reason I walked up here. She loved you, Mr. Cade. My whole life she loved you. She talked about you like," he shook his head, searching, "like you were somebody good, like you were somebody she missed. She'd tell me about this ranch, about the mountains you could see, about how you counted firewood under your breath and thought nobody noticed." The room tilted. "She noticed," I said. It came out barely a whisper. "She noticed everything about you," Eli said. That was the whole tragedy of it, don't you see? She noticed everything. She spent her whole life noticing you and hoping you'd notice her back. I have to stop here and tell you what that did to me, because if I just move on you'll think I heard those words and understood them, and I didn't, not right away. It took a long time. It's still taking. Because you understand, I had built my entire peace, 11 years of solitude up on that bench land. Every quiet dawn, every ordered woodpile, I had built all of it on a single load-bearing lie. And the lie was this: she chose to leave and she never looked back and she forgot me the way I taught myself to forget her. That lie was the foundation of everything. It was the thing that let me sleep. As long as she'd forgotten me, then the silence between us was mutual, was fair, was two people going their separate ways. As long as she'd forgotten me, I hadn't lost anything that hadn't chosen to be lost. And this boy had just walked up my drive and kicked the foundation out. She loved you your whole life. She noticed everything. She hoped you'd notice her back. If that was true, and I could see in his ruined face that it was true, that he had walked God knew how many miles and slept in a ditch to make sure I knew it was true. Then everything was different. Then the silence hadn't been mutual at all. Then there had been a woman out there in the world, my daughter, my own blood, reaching for me across 26 years the same way she'd reached for me across the kitchen table when she was 6, and I hadn't just failed to reach back. I'd burned her letters. I put my head in my hands. There were letters, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. In the beginning, she wrote. She told me, Eli said softly. She wrote you 4 times the first 2 years. She said you never answered. He hesitated. She figured you were still angry. She kept thinking you'd come around. She kept right up until the end, Mr. Cade. She kept thinking there'd be time. That someday you'd come around and there'd be time to fix it. I burned them, I said. The words fell into the warm kitchen like stones into a well. I made myself look up at him. I owed him that at least. I'd earned the right to nothing, but I could at least not hide from him while I confessed it. I burned your mother's letters, I said, unopened. I stood at that stove right there and I watched them burn, and I told myself I told myself a story about why. I never read a single word she wrote me. I don't know what any of them said. I waited for him to hate me. It would have been the right thing. It would have been a relief almost. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind kept pouring through the dead grass. Sweep sighed and shifted at his feet. I know what they said, he told me. I stared at him. She kept copies, he said. She kept a copy of every letter she ever wrote you, even the ones she never sent. He reached down, wincing, to the pack he'd set beside his chair, and he worked open the flap with cold, stiff fingers, and he drew out a bundle, a thick bundle, worn soft at the edges, tied with a length of ordinary kitchen string. There's more than 4 here, he said. There's, I don't know, dozens. Most of them she never mailed. She just wrote them, on your birthday mostly, on hers. On the day she left, whenever she missed you, I guess, which was, his voice broke fully now and he didn't fight it. Which was always, she missed you always. He set the bundle on the table between us. I looked at it and I could not move to touch it. 26 years of my daughter's voice, sitting on my kitchen table, tied up with string. Every word she'd tried to say to me, and every word she'd been too afraid to send. The whole record of a love I had spent my life refusing to believe in, because believing in it would have meant facing what I'd done with it. I can't, I said. You can, Eli said. You have to, that's why I came. And then more gently, seeing the state of me, not all at once. You don't have to read them all at once, but you have to read them, Mr. Cade. She wanted you to. That was almost the last thing she said to me. She made me promise I'd find you and give you these and make you read them so you'd know. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, a young man's rough, impatient gesture, and underneath it he looked about 10 years old. So you'd know she never stopped, so you wouldn't have to spend the rest of your life thinking she forgot you. And there it was, the thing that broke me all the way open, past anything my father ever built in me, past 61 years of learned and practiced stone. She hadn't been protecting herself with those letters. She hadn't even been protecting the truth. On her deathbed, 4 months ago, dying of a cancer I never knew she had, in pain I'll never know the full measure of, my daughter had spent some of her very last words making sure that I would be all right, that I wouldn't have to carry the particular grief of thinking I'd been forgotten. She had used her dying breath to try to spare me a pain, when I was the one who'd caused every pain she ever knew. That's who she was, that's who I threw away. I reached out and I put my hand on the bundle of letters, and I felt the soft, worn edges of the paper under my split old glove, still on from the woodpile, and I began, at 61 years of age, to weep in a way I had not wept since I was a boy standing at my own mother's grave, great, ugly, heaving sobs that I could not have stopped if the house had caught fire around me, the whole boarded-over well of me finally, catastrophically, giving way. And Eli Reyes, my grandson, this stranger, this gift I had done nothing to deserve, got up out of his chair with that hand pressed to his hurt side, and he came around the table, and he put his arms around an old man he'd known for less than an hour, and he held me while I fell apart. "It's okay," he kept saying, this boy to me. "It's okay, it's okay." It wasn't. It wasn't okay, and it never would be, and we both knew it. But he said it anyway, because he was hers, because she'd raised him to be the thing I'd never learned to be, someone who could hold a hurting person and let them be hurt, and stay, and not board it over and not run. We stayed like that a long time, longer than I'd have thought two grown men could. And when it finally eased, when I finally got myself back to some kind of quiet, the mug of coffee stone cold in front of me, and the light through the window gone from gray to the thin gold of full morning, I became aware again of the thing I'd half noticed on the drive and been too torn apart to ask about. The hand at his side, the careful way he moved, the gauntness that was more than grief. "You're hurt," I said. Eli went back to his chair, sat down slow. "It's nothing," he said, which is what a person says when it is very much something. "Son," the word came out of me before I knew it was coming, and it landed in the room and neither of us knew quite what to do with it, this stranger's word, this word I'd never once earned. "You walked up here favoring that leg and holding your side like you're keeping your ribs in. You slept in a ditch. You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in a week. Now I've got no right in this world to ask you anything, but I'm asking, what's wrong with you?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I watched the calculation move behind his mother's eyes. How much to tell, how much to spare me, the same instinct she'd have had, the same instinct that had made her keep a lifetime of unsent letters rather than lay her grief on anyone. "There's a reason I came now," he said finally, "instead of before, instead of waiting till spring, doing it right." He touched his side again unconsciously. "There's some men looking for me, back where I came from. I owed, it doesn't matter what I owed or to who. It matters that I couldn't pay it, and they made that my problem, and it got," he gestured vaguely at himself, at the leg, the ribs. "It got physical, and I ran. And this is the one place in the whole world I could think to run to. Because it's the end of the road and nobody knows about it, and my mother spent my whole life making it sound like the one safe place there ever was." He looked up at me, and for the first time since he'd walked up my drive, the boy underneath showed all the way through, scared and young, and out of road. "I didn't come here to ask you for anything," he said. "I want you to know that. I came to give you the letters. That's all I came to do, that's the whole promise I made her. But I've got nowhere else to go, Mr. Cade, and they're not going to stop looking." The wind moved through the grass. The mountain stood blue and patient beyond the window, older than anything a person could ruin. And I understood, sitting there in my warm kitchen with my dead daughter's letters under my hand and her living son across the table, that I was being offered something I had spent my entire life proving I didn't deserve. A second chance. Not with her, that door was shut forever, sealed 4 months back, and no amount of weeping would ever crack it. But with him. With the piece of her that was still here, still breathing, still reachable and in trouble and asking, not quite asking, for exactly the thing I'd never given anyone. To be let in, to be kept, to not be sent away. I got up from the table. My knees cracked. I went to the window and looked out at the woodpile, at the 2 cords stacked and the 2 I still needed before the snow, at the axe standing in the frost where I'd left it a lifetime ago. "Well," I said, "first thing is we get some food in you, then we see to that side. Then," I turned around and looked at my grandson, and I made the second decision of that morning, and unlike the first one 26 years ago, I made this one right. "Then we figure out what to do about the men who are looking, together. Because you're not going anywhere, Eli. Do you hear me? You walk to the end of the road, and this is where the road ends, and you're staying." He didn't say anything. He just put his face in his hands, the same way I had, and his shoulders shook, and I understood that too. Some things are too big to answer with words. Some things you can only answer by staying. The wound was worse than he'd let on. I got him out of the canvas jacket and the sweat-stiff shirt underneath it there at the kitchen table, and when the cloth peeled away from his side, he made a sound between his teeth that he tried to swallow and couldn't, and I saw why he'd been walking with that hand pressed flat. There was a boot's worth of bruising spread purple and yellow-green across 3 ribs, low on the right, and a split above it where something, a ring, a buckle, the corner of a heel had opened the skin, and it had scabbed and torn and scabbed again over what must have been days of walking, so that the whole of it wept a thin pink watery blood that told me it hadn't been let alone long enough to close. "You should have gone to a doctor," I said. "Doctors ask questions," Eli said. "Doctors keep records." He said it flat, tired, a young man reciting a rule he'd learned the hard way. "You don't get to have a doctor when there's men looking for you. You just get to hurt." I've kept a homestead alone for 11 years and worked cattle for 40 before that, and there is not a great deal of difference between a torn-up steer and a torn-up boy when it comes to the actual doing of the work. You clean it, you close what'll close, you keep it from turning, and you pray. I had him lie on his good side on the daybed by the wood stove, and I heated water and got out the kit I keep for exactly the kind of thing that happens to a body far from town, and I worked on him in the gold morning light while Sweep watched from the floor with her chin on her paws, and her eyes going back and forth between us like she was keeping score. I have gentle hands. It surprised me to remember that. Ruth used to say it, back before the well got boarded all the way over. "You've got the gentlest hands and the hardest heart of any man I ever met, Del Cade, and I'll never understand how they belong to the same person." I hadn't had cause to use the gentleness on another human being in longer than I could reckon. It came back like a language you spoke as a child. I cleaned the torn place and I closed it with the small, careful pulls that hurt least, and Eli lay still and breathed through it and looked at the ceiling, and neither of us said much. But once, when I hit a bad spot and he flinched, and I stopped and waited for him without being asked. Once he turned his head and looked at me, and there was a thing in his face I have to try hard to describe. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was more like recognition. Like a man who's read a photograph his whole life finally standing in front of the real thing, checking it against what he was told and finding, to his surprise, maybe against his own hopes, that the story matched. "She was right about your hands," he said quietly. I had to stop working for a second. "She never saw my hands do this," I said. I wasn't a man who did this. Not for her." "No," Eli agreed. "But she said you could have been. She always said that. She said the man was in there. She said she'd seen him a couple times when you didn't know she was looking." He winced as I started again. "That's the part I never got growing up. How you can love somebody for the man they could have been. Seems like that just be sad. Seems like that just hurt the whole time." "It would," I said. "It does. I know a little something about loving a person you've decided not to reach." He was quiet a moment. "Yeah," he said, "I guess you do." I fed him after that. Eggs and the end of a ham and bread I'd baked myself 2 days before because a man alone learns to do for himself or does without. And he ate like something that had been hungry a long time and had learned not to trust that food would keep coming fast at first, then slowing, then making himself slow down, embarrassed. I sat across from him and drank coffee and didn't watch him too close, because I remembered from cattle and from the one hard winter after Ruth left that a hungry thing eats better when it doesn't feel watched. The letters sat on the table the whole time. Neither of us touched them. They sat there between the salt and the butter dish like a third person at the meal, patient, waiting. When he'd finished and pushed the plate back, and some color had come into his face that hadn't been there before, I put my hand on the bundle again. "Tell me about the men," I said. "All of it. Don't spare me and don't spare yourself. If you're going to stay here, and you are, then I need to know exactly what's coming up my drive and when and how many." So he told me. I won't set it all down, because most of it doesn't matter to what this story is, and because some of it was the ordinary sad machinery of how a good kid with no father and a dying mother, and no money ends up owing the wrong people. A job that wasn't a job, a favor that was a hook, a debt that grew teeth the moment his mother got sick and he stopped being able to run for them. There was a man named Corso who ran the thing, and two others who did what Corso wanted done. And Eli had watched them do it to other people, and then, when Marisol died and Eli went quiet and stopped answering and finally ran, they'd done a smaller version of it to him in a parking lot to make a point. And then they'd started looking, because you don't let a person walk away, because letting one walk teaches all the others they can walk too. They'll figure out where I went, Eli said. Not fast, but eventually. Mom never told anybody about you. You were like her secret, the one thing that was just hers. But there's a cousin who knew there was family out west somewhere. Ranch country, it's not much, but Corso's patient, and it's a thread, and he'll pull it. He looked at me steadily. I'm not going to lie to you and say I led them here and it's fine. I might have led them here. I don't know. That's the honest answer. I ran to the one place I felt safe without thinking hard enough about whether coming here made you not safe. And by the time I did think about it, I was already 3 states in and there was nowhere else, and his jaw worked. My jaw, my father's jaw. I wanted to meet you before I died or got taken back or whatever's going to happen. That's the selfish truth of it. I wanted to meet you once. The wind had died down outside. The morning had gone still and bright and cold. The kind of high mountain stillness that makes you feel like the whole world is holding its breath to see what you'll do. All right, I said. That's it, all right. You want me to yell at you? I set my coffee down. I sent your mother out into the world at 19 with nothing but her own courage and a boy she loved, because I was too proud and too scared and too much my own father's son to say 4 kind words to her. And she went out there and she raised you alone. And she raised you into somebody who'd walk 1,000 miles on a broke rib to keep a promise to a dead woman. And who'd sit at my table and tell me the whole ugly truth, even when a lie would have been easier and safer for you. You know what that tells me, Eli? He didn't answer. It tells me she did the thing I never could, I said. She raised a man who tells the truth even when it costs him. So no, I'm not going to yell at you for leading trouble up my drive. I've got trouble up my drive that's 26 years old and 100 times worse than any man named Corso. This new trouble I can maybe do something about. That old trouble I can't do a damn thing about but sit with, so we'll take the one we can fight. I stood up. Now. I've got some phone calls to make, and there's a shotgun and a rifle in this house, and I know how to use both. And I've got 160 acres of hard country I know better than any city man ever will. But before any of that, I picked up the bundle of letters. I worked the kitchen string loose with fingers that shook, and I don't mind admitting it. And I set the string aside careful because she'd tied it, and I wasn't going to throw away a thing her hands had tied. And I took the first letter off the top. Before any of that, I said, I'm going to keep the promise you kept. You walked all this way to make me read these. I'm not going to make you have walked it for nothing. Sit with me while I read her. And Eli sat back down at my table, and I put on my reading glasses, and I read my daughter's voice for the first time in my life. I'm not going to give you all of them. Some things a man ought to keep. But I'll give you the one that broke the last of me, because you've come this far with me and you've earned the seeing of it, and because I think Marisol would have wanted somebody to know she wrote it, even if it took 26 years and a stranger's telling to make it real. It was dated on my 60th birthday, a year and some before she died. She never sent it. It was one of the ones she just wrote. Dad, it began, and just that word in her handwriting, which I'd have known anywhere, which was the same careful looping hand she'd had at 12 leaving me notes I never answered. Just that one word about finished me before I'd read a line. Dad, you're 60 today. I did the math this morning and it stopped me cold in the kitchen and Eli asked what was wrong and I couldn't even tell him. 60. I keep a picture of you in my head and in the picture you're 40-something, still dark-haired, still swinging that axe, and I know that's not you anymore. I know you're an old man now, and I'll probably never see the old man you turned into, and that's the thing that gets me. Not that I lost the father I had. That I'm losing all the fathers you were going to be, 1 year at a time, and I don't get to meet any of them. I'm not angry anymore. I want you to know that wherever you are, even though you'll never read this. I was angry for a long time. I was angry the whole first years when I wrote you and you didn't answer, and I told myself all kinds of things about why. But I'm a mother now and I understand some things I didn't. I understand you can love a child so much it scares you, and I understand that some people, when they get scared, they go quiet and hard instead of soft, and I think that's you, Dad. I think you loved me so much it scared you, and your own father taught you that being scared was weak, so you buried it, and you buried me right along with it because I was the thing that made you feel it. I used to think you didn't love me. Now I think you loved me too much to survive it, and you chose to survive. I forgive you for that. I do. I forgive you and I miss you, and if you ever read this, it wasn't your fault the way you think it was. It was just a sad thing that happened to two people who didn't have the words. That's all. That's all it ever was. I hope you're warm. I hope somebody's up there with you. I hope you still count the firewood. Your daughter always. Mari. I set the letter down on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Sweet breath slow on the floor. Out beyond the window the mountains stood in their blue patience, not caring, the way mountains don't, and the light came in gold and ordinary across a table where an old man sat holding a piece of paper as if it were the last warm thing in a cold world. I think you loved me too much to survive it, and you chose to survive. She'd understood me better than I ever understood myself. She'd sat somewhere in a kitchen 1,000 miles away, a woman I'd thrown into the world, and she'd looked back across all that distance and all that silence and all that wreckage, and she'd seen the actual truth of me. Not the monster I half believed I was, not the wronged father I sometimes told myself I was, but the plain, sad, accurate thing. A man who loved so much it scared him, and who'd been taught that the fear was shameful, and who chose the boarded over well over the drowning. She'd seen it, and instead of hating me for it, she'd forgiven me for it, in a letter she never even sent, because forgiving me was something she did for her own heart's sake and not for mine. I had spent 11 years up on that bench land, believing I'd made peace with my life. I understood now that I'd never made peace with anything. I'd just gotten far enough away from the war that I couldn't hear the guns, and my daughter, dying, had reached across the whole distance of it to hand me the peace I couldn't make for myself. It wasn't your fault the way you think it was. And I had almost gone to my own grave never knowing she'd offered it. I would have if not for the boy. I looked up at Eli. He was crying quietly, not trying to hide it, watching me read his mother the way you'd watch someone open a gift you'd carried a long way and weren't sure they'd understand. You walked 1,000 miles, I said. My voice came out cracked and strange. On a broke rib, sleeping in ditches, with men hunting you, to hand an old man a piece of paper that says he's forgiven. Yeah, Eli said. Why? I said. Why would you do that? I'm nothing to you. I'm the man who threw your mother away. By any accounting you ought to have burned these the way I burned hers and let me rot up here never knowing. Why would you carry them to me? Why would you carry me? And my grandson wiped his face with the back of his hand, that young rough gesture, and he looked at me with his mother's dark eyes, and he gave me the answer I have carried every day since, the answer that is the whole reason I'm alive to tell you any of this at all. Because she asked me to, he said, and because he stopped, steadied, because she loved you your whole life for the man you could have been, and I figured the least I could do, the one thing I could do for her that she couldn't do for herself, was come out here and find out if she was right, if the man was really in there. He almost smiled through the tears. And he is. I watched you sew up my side with your mother's with her gentle hands. I watched you read her and fall apart. He's in there, Mr. Cade. He was in there the whole time. She wasn't wrong. She was never wrong about you. She just ran out of time to be right about you to your face. That was the most emotional conversation of my life. Right there, at that table, over a plate of eggs and a bundle of letters and a boy's torn ribs. I've had 61 years of conversations, and I never had one before or since that reached down that far. My daughter, dead 4 months, spoke to me through the two things she left behind, her own words on paper, and her son's living voice. And between them they told me the thing I'd spent my whole life making sure no one could ever tell me. You are loved, and you were always loved, and it was never too late until exactly now. And even now it's not too late for everything. Not too late for everything. Because the boy was still here, still breathing, still reachable, and in trouble. I made the calls. That part I'll keep short, because the machinery of it doesn't belong in a story about a heart cracking open, but you should know how it went so you're not left wondering. I've lived up on that bench land 11 years and I keep to myself. But a man doesn't work a country 40 years without knowing people, and some of the people I know are the kind who understand debts and hunting and men named Corso. I called a lawyer I trusted, an old, rough, honest woman down in the county seat named Pat Bledsoe who'd handled the sale of my last cattle and never once talked down to me. I told her the shape of it, no names at first, then the names. She told me things I needed to know about how a debt like Eli's could be made to legally evaporate, about protective filings and paper trails, and the fact that men like Corso hate two things above all others: a record and a witness who'll talk. She told me that a scared kid who runs is prey, but a scared kid standing behind a landowner, a lawyer, and a county sheriff who owes that landowner a favor from a bad winter 12 years back is a different and far less appetizing proposition. And then I made the decision, the heavy one, the one I've turned over most since. Because here is the thing Pat told me, the thing that made it hard. The clean way to protect Eli, the legal way, the way that made the debt evaporate and put Corso on the wrong side of a paper trail, meant Eli had to talk, officially, on record, about everything he'd seen those men do to him and to others. It meant he couldn't just hide out at the end of my road and heal up and disappear into ranch work under a quiet sky. It meant he had to stand up with his name attached and be a witness, and being a witness meant, for a while, being findable, being exposed, trading the safety of the shadows for the harder, riskier, slower safety of the law. And it was my call in the end. Because he was hurt and scared and half out of road, and he looked to me to make it. The way a boy looks to the one adult in the room who seems to know what he's doing. I could have told him to hide. It was safer in the short run. I could have kept him up on my land and never let his name touch a document, and maybe Corso pulls the thread and maybe he doesn't, and we'd have lived under that maybe for years, watching the drive, sleeping light. Or I could tell him to stand up, to do the frightening, exposed, correct thing, to trust the slow machinery instead of the quick shadow, to be, God help me, the exact opposite of what I'd been my whole life. Because that was the plain truth staring at me from across the table. My whole life had been hiding, boarding over the well, choosing the shadow because the shadow felt safe. And it had cost me my daughter. It had cost me everything. I was not going to teach her son to hide. You're going to stand up, I told him. You're going to talk to Pat, and then you're going to talk to the sheriff, and you're going to put your name on it, and it's going to be scary. And for a while it's going to be more dangerous than hiding would be, not less. I want you to understand that. I'm not choosing the safe thing for you, Eli. I'm choosing the right thing, and I'm choosing it knowing it could go wrong. And I need you to look at me and tell me you understand that. Because I've spent my whole life choosing safe over right, and I have got nothing to show for it but 160 acres of nobody. He looked at me a long time. She'd have wanted the safe thing, he said quietly. Mom, she'd have told me to hide. She spent her whole life hiding how much things hurt. She'd have wanted me safe. No, I said, and this was the heaviest part, the part I've never been sure of, the part I'll wonder about till I'm in the ground beside my own mother. I know she would, and I'm telling you to do the other thing anyway. I'm overruling your dead mother, Eli, and I don't have the right, and I'm doing it because I think the hiding is what killed her slow from the inside for 26 years, and I would rather you be scared and standing up in the light than safe and quiet in the dark. I would rather that for you. Even if it's wrong, even if it costs you, because I already ran the other experiment. I ran it with your mother, and I know how it ends. He was crying again. So was I, two grown men with the same stubborn jaw, weeping at a kitchen table in the gold October light. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, Grandpa." First time he said it, Grandpa, just slipped out of him unplanned the way the truest words do. I had to get up and go stand at the window for a minute after that. I told myself it was to check the drive. It's been 3 years now. I'm 64. My knees are worse and my hands are the same gentle, useless and useful things they always were. And there's still snow on the far ranges most of the year, blue and patient, older than anything a person could ruin. It went about the way Pat said it would. It was scary. There was a bad stretch that first winter where we watched the drive and slept light and Sweep spent her nights by the door. And once there was a truck that came halfway up and sat there a long cold minute before it turned around. And I never did find out who it was and I've decided not to. But Eli stood up. He talked on record with his name attached, and it turned out he wasn't the only one Corso had done things to. And once one stood up in the light, others found they could too. Which is exactly the thing men like Corso are most afraid of, and exactly why they never let the first one walk. Corso is in prison now. 2 of his men too. It's not a fairy tale, those men have friends and the world is still the world and we still sometimes watch the drive. But the debt evaporated, the way Pat promised. The hook came out. The boy got to be a man in the light instead of prey in the dark. He stayed. That's the part I still can't quite believe on the good mornings when I let myself feel it. He stayed. He healed up over that first winter and he took to the ranch work like it was in his blood, which I suppose it was on one side. He's got Marisol's warmth and my stubbornness, and a way with the mule that I never had. Judge follows him around like a dog. He met a girl in the county seat, a nurse, patient and dry-humored, and I think that's going somewhere. And I've decided not to say anything about it and just watch it happen, because I have finally, at 64, learned to let a good thing grow without reaching in and boarding it over. We read the letters together, that first winter, all of them, one a night, slow. I know my daughter now better than I knew her when she lived under my roof, which is its own particular grief and its own particular gift, and I've stopped trying to separate the two because I don't think they separate. I count the firewood out loud now, on purpose, because someone told me once in a letter written on my 60th birthday that she'd noticed I did it quiet and thought nobody knew. So now I do it loud. 41, 42. It's a small thing, but I do it loud so that if she can hear me, wherever she is, she'll know I finally figured out the one lesson she spent her whole life trying to teach me. That the people who love you are always listening, even the quiet ones. Especially the quiet ones. And the only real sin, the only one that can't be undone, the one I nearly died having committed, is to make them do all their loving in the dark, alone, into a silence you're too scared to break. I broke my silence, too late for her, in time for him. Some mornings that feels like grace. Some mornings it feels like the cruelest arithmetic there is. Mostly it feels like both, at the same time, which I've come to understand is just what it feels like to finally be a whole person. Everything at once, the loss and the love in the same breath, nothing boarded over. Eli's out at the woodpile right now. I can hear him. He's got the axe going, that dry clean crack of good oak splitting true, and every so often the sound stops for a second and I know, I don't have to look, that he stopped to catch his breath and look out at those blue mountains and think about his mother. He counts the firewood too, out loud. I taught him that. I never told him where I learned it. Some things you just leave for the reader too.